Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Today, just a single pub, the George and Vulture in the City of London. Cheers from the George and Vulture. It's a listed building and we have some quite detailed notes from Historic England on the exterior. They believe it to be early 18th century, refronted in the early 19th century, then with some later alterations. It's actually quite hard to get a look at the whole thing as it's hidden down a couple of alleyways, with one entrance being from George Yard, leading into St Michael's Alley, and the other entrance being from Castle Court. Looking at it from George Yard, there's just a tiny slither of one corner of the building sandwiched between its more modern neighbours. We can perhaps compare that scene with this drawing from around 1920. The Castle Court side similarly doesn't have a huge amount of breathing space. That door from Castle Court is described by Historic England as a central round arched entrance with fluted pilastered architrave and keystone, fanlight and panelled doors. There's a curved lamp bracket above that and a lamp with etched glass containing the name George and Vulture, although that's not included in the listing, so it could be more modern. Up above there, on the second floor, are Art Nouveau stained glass windows, presumably late Victorian or Edwardian. The other entrance around the corner, close to George Yard, has a segmental arch above it and is flanked by Doric columns. Those columns are partially wrapped by these brass panels, which have once again the name George and Vulture, and also Thomas's Chophouse. Given that second name, we can date those to the Edwardian period, and we'll come back to that later. That naming is repeated in etched glass panes in the doors. Close to that entrance, two parish boundary markers are on the wall. One is dated 1814, the initials SEK for St Edmund, King and Martyr on Lombard Street. The other with the initials SMC, which stand for St Michael, Cornhill. The parish boundary runs through the middle of the George and Vulture. Inside we have further notes from Historic England, as well as a description from Camera, as it's on their list of historic interiors. Here it's a 2-star rating out of a possible 3. Entering from the George Yard entrance, we're first met with a small foyer. Stairs here lead to the upper floors, which I didn't see on my visit, and although this section of the staircase is believed to be 19th century, higher up there are apparently earlier 18th century staircases. Doors from that foyer lead through to the main ground floor room. The other entrance from Castle Court leads initially into this vestibule with yet more etched glass proclaiming the name of the establishment. In that main room, much of the interior is 19th century, but in an 18th century style. A lot of these fittings are fixed together and in oak. From the dado panelling, to the bench seating, to this impressive carved overmantel with its scrolled pediment. That overmantel contains a reassuringly old-looking clock and a panel depicting a mail coach outside an inn named the Bunch of Grapes. A coal fire was burning in its brown marble surround on my visit. You can hopefully see here how the dado panelling, bench seating and part of the overmantel are all integrated together. So most of that is from the 19th century, however there are potentially even older parts to the interior. On the other side of that room is what Camera's notes describe as an ancient and dramatic fireplace, possibly 18th century, with a decorative tiled surround. This part of the interior was gratifyingly dimly lit, so it was hard to get a good shot of this, but I thought it was quite a beautiful fitting. On one wall is a plaque about Charles Dickens, we'll come back to him later, and another pair of those parish boundary markers. A reminder the boundary runs right through the middle of the room here. These have earlier dates than the ones outside, here 1712 and 1734. Various other Dickensian memorabilia is dotted about the place, including this bust over by a window and what I think are some insurance papers relating to the great writer. The servery is small and tucked into one corner of that main room. Camera's notes suggest that it might have originally been a publican's office rather than a bar counter as it is used today. There's glazing in that which almost looks like it can slide down to close the bar. Above that is a quite dramatic broken pediment. The front of the bar counter has a similar style of fielded panelling to the walls. One side of that main room juts out slightly from the rest of the building and has a glazed roof, so the lighting here is brighter if you're not a fan of that atmospheric gloom to be found elsewhere. They've hung up a garland of hops here, which I think is a nice touch. Throughout the room are low booth-style tables which seem to strike a good compromise between it being cosy but also convivial, especially with that open fire. Let's take a look at the history of the George and Vulture. Some sources suggest that there has been an inn on this site since 1142. On the exterior there is a claim to a date of 1600. It is believed the inn was originally simply called the George. We actually have a reference to that in John Stow's Survey of London, first published in 1598. This excerpt is talking about Lombard Street. It's a bit difficult to follow, being over 400 years old and in early modern English, but I'll give it a go. Next is a common hostelry. I think that's an early version of hostelry for travellers, called the George of such a sign. This is said to have pertained to the Earl Ferrers and was his London lodging in Lombard Street, and that in the year 1175. There had been some references to another nearby pub called the Vulture around the time of the Great Fire of London in 1666, and it seems, broadly speaking, the two premises likely combined with a rebuild following the fire to create the name we have today. There are more flowery versions of this story, including a pet vulture in a cage squawking loudly and annoying passers-by, but I'm going to try and stick to the documented facts here. The earliest written reference I found to this pub as the George and Vulture is in the London Gazette of 1673. Moving into the 1700s, in Bertram Waldram Matz's book of 1921 titled The Inns and Taverns of Pickwick, he states that the first Beefsteak Club was formed here by Richard Estcourt, which I believe would have been around the year 1705, although other sources disagree on where that first venue was. This was a dining club at which, as the name suggests, the attendees feasted on beefsteak and discussed topical issues such as politics and the arts. A few decades later, in the 1730s, another club reportedly had its meetings here. This time a somewhat more controversial organisation, the Hellfire Club. Sir Francis Dashwood is supposed to have founded the club, although he referred to it as the Order of the Friars of St Francis of Wickham, amongst other names. Other alleged members of the club included John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, and possibly even William Hogarth, as he painted this portrait of Dashwood, making him look a bit like Francis of Assisi. I suspect in the era they were convening here at the George and Vulture, the activities of the Hellfire Club were comparatively restrained, but as they later moved on to more private venues, it all became a bit more debauched. Here's some commentary from 1860, and of course you can rely on the Victorians to look back on the Georgians with a suitable level of sanctimony. The Hellfire Club was established, it seems, simply to outrage all the refined usages of society, as well as to manifest contempt for religion and the attributes of divine worship. Not only did the members of this dissolute association drink to excess, but they also sought to carry their obscene orgies into consecrated sites and to hold their debaucheries within the walls once dedicated to heaven, assuming to themselves for the time the semblance of a brotherhood of monks. It then goes on to describe with a constant undertone of moral outrage what sounds to me like a bit of risque landscape gardening with possibly some suggestive topiaries. It didn't take much to wind the Victorians up, did it? Moving into the 1830s, the George and Vulture is perhaps most famous for its associations with Charles Dickens. Not only was he apparently a regular, as it says on the plaque, oft he lunched here, but it features heavily in his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. It's interesting given that often Dickens renamed places in his novels. In Limehouse, several pubs along the river have laid claim to being the model for the 6 Jolly Fellowship Porters in Our Mutual Friend, but here Dickens doesn't beat about the bush. He even gives the pub's address, so there is no doubt. While I was at the George and Vulture, a nice chap called Martin came over to say hello. He had apparently seen some of my pub videos, and we talked about these Dickensian associations for a while. Martin said that when Dickens was talking to his prospective publishers, Chapman and Hall, about the novel he had yet to write, The Pickwick Papers, they asked him what it was about, and he said something along the lines of, "I don't know yet, but it is going to be set in the George and Vulture." There's still a Christmas meal for descendants of Charles Dickens held here at the George and Vulture each year. I was intrigued by this alternative name for the George and Vulture seen on the entrances. Thomas's Chophouse. Looking through the newspapers, I think that was probably just for a time in the Edwardian period. Here's a newspaper mention from 1903 talking about this name change along with some other Dickensian taverns. And it also seems there was a fire here in 1906. Today, the George and Vulture is ran by Sam Smiths. I think it would be fair to say it's not exactly a pub in its current incarnation. It's a chop house and operates more like a restaurant. I actually did have lunch while I was there, but there is a note on Camera's page about the George and Vulture that you can just come in for a drink if tables are available. On my visit, a Tuesday lunchtime in February, all the tables were laid out for dining, but it was only about half full and I was able to walk in without a reservation. I was given a very nice table by the fire, in fact. It is all table service. The bar is very small, so I don't think it's really somewhere you could stand or prop up the bar for a drink. But again, if you can get here when it's quiet, perhaps outside of meal times, you apparently can just come for a drink. The staff seemed very nice and welcoming to me. They don't have any hand pumps, so there's no real ale on offer, and in terms of draft beer, it's just 2 of Sam Smith's beers on the keg taps, Taddy Lager and Old Brewery Bitter. I started with a pint of OBB, which was fine, although of course I'd prefer the cask version. The keg one is a bit gassy and doesn't have the same depth of flavour. They do have some of Sam Smith's bottled beers on offer as well. I was in the mood for a stout. I'm probably sticking my neck out here a bit, as I know some people have strong feelings about Sam Smith's beer, but I think their chocolate stout is delicious. As I say, I also had lunch while I was here, and to head off any comments that I didn't talk about the food, I'm actually a vegetarian. It's a chop house famous for grilled meats, and I don't think it would be particularly interesting or representative to talk about how the vegetarian option was. Perhaps you can go and ask Gary Eats to review the place, and his video will be much more successful than this one. So again, it's not exactly a pub in its current incarnation, but I really enjoyed my time here. It's very atmospheric, it's steeped in history, and has a really appealing interior with some genuinely old components to it. I think it's well worth a visit. Okay, so that's going to be it for today from the George and Vulture. Sorry that most of the narration, whatever you call it, was voiceover from home, but it's a thriving, happily chop house in the city and just wasn't really a good place to be talking to camera. The George and Vulture is just round the corner from a possibly more famous city chop house, Simpson's Tavern, which has sadly been closed for, is it about 2 years now? There is some dispute with, I think, the freehold owner versus the leasehold/business owners. On a weekday lunchtime in years past, that would have been thriving inside this time of day. Alas, now sadly empty. There is a campaign in progress, I believe, an ongoing campaign by the business owners and some of the loyal customers of the business to try and get it to reopen. I'll put a link down in the description to that because I think it is quite an important city institution. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.